Good afternoon and welcome everybody to this our first CRADLE seminar for the year that is properly hybrid. So we have been at it trying to sort it out, and I think we've got it working with big thanks to Joanna Tai, our resident IT guru. My name is Rola Jawi. I'm a professor of education and research at CRADLE. It is my honour to be chairing this session and to be welcoming Professor Rachel Brooks to visit us here at CRADLE all the way from the University of Surrey in the UK, and we have switched on the weather for her, so just the sunshine. Just as we start, I would like to also welcome you, everyone who's on Zoom and everyone who's in the room. I'd like to start by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of the land on which we are gathered today. We pay our respects to the local people for allowing us to have our gathering on their land, and to their elders past, present and future. Today's seminar is not about assessment, but it is about higher education, and it is about how students are constructed in higher education. Professor Rachel Brooks is a professor of sociology and the Associate Dean of Research and Innovation at the University of Surrey, and she'll be talking about a big research project she led, funded by the European Union, to the tune of £1.5 million. So for us higher education researchers here in Australia, $3 million, like it's just astronomical. So Rachel will be talking about her research, how she investigated contemporary higher education students, how they understand their roles, and the extent to which this differs both within and across nation states. So with that, I'd like to welcome you, Rachel, to come up. As per usual, Rachel's going to talk between 30-40 minutes. We're going to take some questions after that from the room and on chat. Feel free to use the chat to communicate for those of you on Zoom, and please use the Q&A function to ask questions. We'll be monitoring that in the background. So without further ado, welcome, Rachel.
Thank you, and big thank you for inviting me here. It's great to come to Australia, and I'm sure I'll love my week in Melbourne, so thank you very much. Okay, so as Rola said, I'm going to be talking about European higher education students and how they understand their role as students and how they feel they're understood by others. So just a little bit of background to kind of situate what I want to say, drawing on the literature in higher education. So as you probably know, many people have argued that as a result of processes such as neoliberalisation and marketisation, higher education systems across the world have become increasingly similar. And as part of this, we're seeing the kind of commodification of learning. And scholars have also argued that as higher education systems become more similar, students themselves have become more similar, increasingly positioned as instrumental employment-focused consumers because of specific policies that have been introduced in many countries of the world, such as high fees, and also policy discourses which position students as consumers. This literature has also argued that we've seen the kind of redefinition of education as a means to various non-educational ends, such as the social inclusion and the liberal purpose of higher education, knowledge for its own sake, having been squeezed out. Now, scholars have also argued that these kind of processes have had a direct impact on learning. So writing with respect to the UK, for example, Molesworth and colleagues have argued that the inculcation of a consumer identity has brought about a much more passive approach to learning, in which students place more emphasis on their rights rather than their responsibilities, and on having a degree rather than being a learner. We can see quite similar arguments played out when we turn our attention to Europe specifically. And so again, I think we can see people making the argument that students are becoming increasingly similar. So we can see, for example, various assumptions implicit in the Erasmus scheme, and this is a scheme where European students can move to another European country for part of their undergraduate degree programme. And so this kind of assumes that what it means to be a student is the same everywhere. You can move unproblematically across national borders. But also there have been various policy initiatives which have explicitly sought to make higher educations more similar across Europe. So the Bologna process, which then led to the European higher education area, have tried to standardise the structures of higher education across the continent. And it's led to some, Slaughter and Cantwell, for example, to argue that across Europe, we've seen this kind of what they call like a reverse engineering of an Anglo-American model of higher education. And some people have argued that as a result of these policy changes, students again have been positioned as consumers in a similar way across Europe. So Moutsios, for example, has argued that as a result of the Bologna process, the academic community has disintegrated, subduing the staff as a workforce under surveillance and positioning students as consumers. So within the literature on both Europe and more generally across the world, there is this kind of broad theme of students becoming increasingly similar. But I do want to just point out a few notes of caution about this, and that some people have said, actually, perhaps this is a kind of oversimplistic way of looking at what's happening. For example, because policies are not always translated simply into student subjectivities. There can be some resistance and dissonance there. And empirical studies of the Bologna process have suggested that nations sometimes use European higher education policy as a kind of cultural script that they can just pick and mix from to kind of do things that they would do themselves anyway, which can lead to some kind of national differences. And then finally, I think it's important to recognise that, nation states aren't always these kind of coherent entities that we might assume, and that we can see differences between institutions within a single nation, and also perhaps also different perspectives between different groups of students. So that's the kind of academic background in which this project is situated. And what we've been trying to do over the past 5 or 6 years is to engage with this debate, but to answer a number of research questions, one of which is, how do students of different national backgrounds understand the role of the higher education student? And to answer this question, we've been collecting data in 6 European nations: Denmark, England, Germany, Ireland, Poland, and Spain. I'll say a little bit about why those countries in a second. And in each of those countries, we collected data in 3 higher education institutions with different profiles, broadly representative of the higher education system in those countries. And in each higher education institution, we conducted 3 focus groups with undergraduate students, involving a total of 295 students. And in the focus groups, one of the things we did was, right at the beginning of the group, we asked students to make 2 models out of plasticine, one to represent how they understood themselves as a student, and one to represent how they felt they were seen by others. And I'm going to use some of these as examples in what I'm going to say in a few minutes. But the project did have some other aspects too. So we were interested in the student perspectives, but we also wanted to gauge what other social actors thought about students. So we conducted a policy analysis, analysing policy documents, interviewing policy makers in the 6 countries. We conducted a media analysis, analysing newspaper articles that talked about students, but also TV shows and films that figured students prominently, and also institutional perspectives. We analysed university websites and also interviewed staff in those 3 higher education institutions per nation, where we also conducted the focus groups with students. Today, I'm going to be mainly focusing on the student data, but I'm going to make a few comparisons to the other data, and obviously happy to answer any questions that you might have about that in the Q&A afterwards. Just a brief table. I'm not going to go into the detail of this. The detail isn't really important, but this is just to show you some of the kind of differences between countries and the kind of reasons for choosing them. So basically, the country choice was to have diversity in terms of welfare regime, the kinds of political constitution of the country, how it approaches social policy, its relationship to the EU. During the project, England left the European Union, and a variety of other different types of relationships, some long-standing members of the European Union, others not. Particularly important for what I'm going to say later, differences in tuition fees for undergraduates, with England at one end of the spectrum, very high fees, Denmark at the other end, no fees, and also students paid a grant to attend university, and other countries in between. And then we also wanted diversity in terms of the type of student support that is offered to students as well, and there's quite a lot of diversity there. So those were the kind of the variables that we used to choose our sample of countries. That's a better way of doing this. In the rest of the presentation, I want to talk through what emerged as some of the dominant constructions of students from our student data. And I want to talk about some that were quite similar across the 6 countries, and others where we saw some quite interesting cross-national differences. I haven't got time to go through them all today, so I'm just going to talk about the ones that I've highlighted in yellow. And there are also some quite interesting differences by institution, but again, I don't have time to go into them in this presentation, but I'd be happy to talk about them in the Q&A afterwards. So I'm going to start off with the similarities across all countries, firstly talking about students as learners, and secondly talking about students as hard workers. So students as learners. In all of the 6 countries, numerous focus group participants made plasticine models that represented in some way the learning that they were undertaking and how they saw this as fundamental to what it meant to them to be a student. Now, these models included, for example, books, laptops, brains, trees and flowers. And there were also a number of models of pathways indicative of the students suggested moving forwards, although sometimes to an unknown destination. I put some examples up here. So a book on the left from a focus group in England, where the student said, I'd be really surprised by how much I feel like my subject has come to define me, and how much genuinely of what I talk about is my subject, and things that I've discovered that I'm really interested in, and to be proud of that. Another example from Denmark. And mine is this little fellow with a big brain. You get a lot of knowledge all the time, and sometimes your brain is bigger than your face and you can't control it. And just 2 other examples here, and these are more about kind of knowledge, or certainly the one on the left is. This is from a German focus group where the student says, I've made something very colourful, abstract. It was important to me to have lots of colours, because while I'm studying, I've noticed I'm discovering so much diversity and lots of different ways of life, and I'm discovering a lot about myself too, things I wouldn't otherwise be able to access, because before everything was prescribed. So a sense of the kind of greater freedom that learning at university offers. And then finally, a graduation cap from Poland that the student says he made this because he associates it with gaining knowledge. This cap symbolises my more academic attitude to learning things, something more than just getting over with these studies and moving on without taking advantage of this knowledge. So again, a sense that knowledge acquisition at university was quite different from what had gone before. Now, I think it was quite interesting to us that this emphasis on learning and the acquisition of knowledge was evident even in the countries with more marketised systems, such as England. And the centrality of learning to many of the models that these students made contrasts quite strongly, I think, with the notable absence of models that foregrounded things like employment or students preparing for work. Or that hinted at kind of more instrumental understandings of what it means to be a student. And I think here there's a really stark difference between these narratives from students and what we saw in the policy that we analysed. So our analysis of higher education policies across Europe has shown how the construction of student as a future worker is often dominant, and that of student as learner is frequently marginal or not even mentioned at all. And our interviews with higher education staff also contrasted with the student data, as they typically saw students as increasingly instrumental in their approach to their studies. I think there are also clear contrasts with the ways in which students are often discussed in the literature, which I alluded to at the start, as some scholars have presented them as first and foremost consumers who are aware of their rights, rather than kind of learners who value the knowledge that they're gaining. And I think that this emphasis on the value of knowledge and truth, even in supposedly post-truth times, which was evident within the student narratives, also diverges quite considerably from William's argument that, with respect to the UK in particular, the liberal purpose of higher education, i.e. the focus on knowledge for its own sake, has been squeezed out as a result of the use of the university system for other ends. So in general, we saw a very positive view of higher education being conveyed in these models, in which it was valued primarily for its impact on students' intellect and their view of the world. So moving on now to students as hard workers. So while representing themselves as learners and or engaged with knowledge was the most common way in which our student participants talked about themselves, another common representation, again evident across all of the countries, was students as hard workers. So students here typically emphasised the demanding amount and level of work that was required of them by their course and how they'd risen to this challenge. And I think it's illustrated quite well with these two slides here. So on the left, we have a student from Ireland who made a model of themselves with their laptop attached to their head. So that's me with a laptop. That's basically what I do all day. That's how I fall asleep. That's how I wake up. Basically, I study, I program, they're doing computer science. That's it. There's not much else. And there's not much time for anything else. And then here from Denmark, it's a snake eating its own tail. Even though I'm moving forwards, I might be learning more, but then I realise I still need to learn more. I still need to improve. So this endless cycle of never knowing enough and always having to work hard to gain more knowledge. And then two more examples here from Poland. My model is a book with a cup of tea. I have to put a lot of effort into learning and so on, and I sacrifice a whole lot of time despite not having a lot of classes at the university. And then from England, I just see myself as studying all the time because my course is just so intense. Like we have lectures all the time, and then you have to go home and just like study, like to prepare yourself. Various commentators have argued that under conditions of marketisation, students have increasingly come to see a degree as a product to be bought rather than a process of learning, which requires effort on their part. And that quotation I put up from Molesworth at the start alluded to this. But I think that in contrast, the models from our participants suggest that not only did focus group participants see the process of learning as central to their understandings of what it means to be a student, but they also viewed it as not always easy and often requiring considerable effort on their part. And so in general, there didn't seem to be any attempt to position themselves as effortless achievers as a means of demonstrating their authentic intelligence, as has been kind of documented in numerous studies of compulsory education and some of higher education as well. But instead, I think the students' narratives would appear to offer some support to Mendick et al.'s contention that for many young people under conditions of what they call austere meritocracy, hard work has come to be seen as a key moral imperative. By this, Mendick et al. Mean that the emphasis on working hard often reflects the language of politicians, in which the appeal to hard work has been used to shore up the idea of a meritocracy and deflect responsibility for social inequalities back to the individual. And I think within higher education policy specifically, the idea of hard work has indeed been discussed by politicians and other social actors. In England, for example, an implicit contrast has been drawn by politicians between those students who work hard and are thoroughly deserving of their degree outcomes on one hand, and on the other hand, those who have not shown such commitment and yet have been unfairly rewarded with a good degree as a result of grade inflation. This has been a very sort of prominent topic of discussion amongst higher education policymakers over recent years. But in Denmark as well, the figure of the lazy student has been used as a foil for introducing a range of reforms intended to encourage students to move more quickly through their studies. While across Europe more generally, reforms associated with the Bologna process have sought to increase the efficiency with which students move through their higher education, with implied consequences, I think, for how hard they're expected to work. It's thus possible, I think, that these kind of discourses serve to underline the expectation of hard work, but also through the assertion that some students are lazy, provoke a reaction in which students are at pains to stress their hard-working nature. So those are just two examples of some of the kind of strong similarities between nations. I'm going on now to talk about some differences, and we're going to start with Spain. Now, it was really interesting, I think, when we looked at the models, without even kind of looking at how people had described them, that there was a really big difference between the very positive models that were typically made by the majority of our students and some of the ones that we saw in Spain, which seemed to convey something very, very different. And so many of the Spanish students tended to be critical of the higher education experience they were receiving and pessimistic about where their degree would lead them. And just a couple of examples here for you. So the green one, the student I see myself alone in the middle of nothing. I have no idea about anything, nor how am I going to finish what I'm studying, nor what to do afterwards, nor what I like. And then the yellow one, I've made a kind of dead figure, like a skull. I don't know if you can see it, but the face is a skull, and it's dragging itself along in desperation because it's trying to arrive and it can't, and it has wings, but they are drooping. Now, we found this kind of contrast between these Spanish models, and there are lots of others kind of along these lines, and those produced in the other 5 countries, really interesting. And, you know, we spent quite a lot of time thinking what are the most kind of plausible explanations for these national differences. And I suppose one of the kind of most plausible explanations for us seemed to relate back to the labour market, because at the time of our data collection, the economic situation in Spain was very different from the other 5 countries. And so at the time we did the data collection, the youth unemployment rate was 34.3% in Spain, which was more than double the EU average, and the highest of all the 6 countries in our study by over 20%. It also had a very high rate of graduate unemployment, which again kind of was much higher than the other 5 nations. And although the quotations on the previous slide don't make explicit reference to this kind of uncertain labour market situation, I think it is kind of implicit in some of them, in the idea about kind of, you know, no idea what to do afterwards and trying to arrive, but it can't. But there were also some participants who were more direct, noting that there were insufficient jobs available for all those who graduated with good grades. And so this is an example here where the student says, I've made a briefcase which symbolises work and a tick which represents good qualifications and grades. All is encircled, but there's a narrow opening. So I see myself as one of the thousands of young Spanish people who work, who study, who get good results. But in the end, we're all inside the same circle, and there's only a narrow exit. So it's a competition, more and more and more, always more. It's never enough. So I think, you know, they were conveying the fact that, you know, there were very few jobs to go round amongst all these highly qualified graduates. I think also the Spanish students' dissatisfaction appeared to be linked as well to what they perceived to be the high fees that they were paying, combined with the poor quality education they were receiving. So although, and I don't know if you saw this in the kind of table that I put out, although the fees in Spain were much lower than those charged in England at the time of our data collection, unlike the situation in England, the Spanish fees had to be paid up front, so putting a considerable financial burden on students. And there seemed to be much greater satisfaction with degree programmes in England than in Spain. And I think this kind of this combination of kind of perceived poor pedagogy and relatively high fees drove quite a lot of the dissatisfaction that we were seeing in Spain. So an example here about the pedagogy. So this student said, well, mine is like a sad and frustrated doll, because I believe they have to change the teaching methodology that they use in class. It has to be more dynamic, different, not the typical one of coming here, sitting down and listening to all they tell you. And really, it was only in Spain where we saw this dissatisfaction with pedagogy expressed in explicit terms. So that was the first cross-national difference that we saw. The second also comes from Spain, but is about students as consumers. Really interestingly, it was only in the Spanish focus groups that the Plasticine models made specific reference to the marketisation of higher education and the implication participants believe this has had for understanding what it means to be a student. And so some examples here. So this one here, the student says, supposedly you're sent to the top of the slide because you learn, so you're a graduate, you're high status, but when you get to the top, you have a series of problems, and they find a way to make you finish up as a consumer product for the system. And secondly, this student here says, I feel about myself as if I was what I've tried to make, a cardboard box to show that I feel like a piece of merchandise in this educational situation, which in the end is more of an attempt at the commercialisation of education than learning. And it was really interesting that these kind of comments weren't made at all in any of the other the 5 countries. And in many ways, this foregrounding of consumerism with respect to the Spanish models, but not elsewhere, is curious, as marketisation is much more firmly established in several of the other nations in the sample. And indeed, the analysis that we carried out of higher education institutional websites has indicated that Spanish students, unlike their counterparts in England, Ireland, and Denmark, are not addressed as consumers, but as either novices in an academic community or as recipients of a public service. And when we interviewed the policymakers in Spain, they seemed themselves to be strongly opposed to a consumerist discourse, whereas our media analysis would also suggest that marketisation isn't discussed very much in the media either. And so I think in seeking to explain the distinctiveness of the Spanish responses, it's possible that the stage of marketisation is significant. In England, for example, market reforms and consumer discourse are now firmly established. University websites clearly address students as consumers, and policy documents are infused with market logic. And so in such circumstances, ideas associated with marketisation may have become so normalised that they're not worthy of comment. In Spain, however, there may be heightened sensitivity and resistance to such ideas because they're relatively new and not yet firmly established in all parts of the higher education. And I think this reflects, to some extent, Mania Klemenchik's argument that national political norms can affect what is seen as an acceptable education policy and what is conversely met with resistance and opposition. I think Spanish students might also be aware of the trajectory taken by higher education systems elsewhere in Europe and keen to avoid shifting to a highly marketised system. The distinctiveness of the Spanish data may also relate, I think, to the way in which higher education is funded. As I mentioned previously, fees are relatively high in Spain and payable upfront by a relatively large proportion of the student population. However, unlike the other countries where relatively high fees are payable, England and Ireland, in Spain there was also this kind of widespread dissatisfaction with the quality of education received. And so to me it seems likely that this combination may cause more students to question the basis for fees, i.e. a consumerist system in which higher education is understood at least partially as an individual good, than in nations where students are broadly happy with the education they're receiving. Okay, so that allows me to move on to the third national difference that I want to talk about. And here we're moving away from Spain to Poland. In Poland, students were broadly in line with our counterparts in the other 5 nations in emphasising the importance of learning and hard work to their understandings of what it meant to be a student and their relatively upbeat assessment of their lives as students. But they differed from their peers in the other 5 countries in suggesting that there was nothing intrinsically different about being a student. Students were just people like everybody else, as the first model, the one on the left, the red one, suggests. So this student says, I've made a regular person because I think that every student is just a regular person, and the fact that you're attending university doesn't make you special in any way. That's it. And then another example here, which kind of, is underpinned by the same idea. this student here focuses on particular characteristics that they had, which seemed to have no obvious connection to being a student specifically. So they said, I formed a person because I see myself as an outgoing person and someone that needs other people to feel good, and I'm always at the centre of attention. And it was really interesting that these kind of comments, which were quite common in Poland, were wholly absent from the focus groups in the other 5 countries, where typically all participants considered there was something specific about being a student, even if the nature of this differed. And I think this is particularly interesting because it also corresponds to the lack of discussion of students within the national media that we found when we did our newspaper analysis and our analysis of TV shows and films, that there were very, very, very few newspaper articles that just talked about students at all. So why might this be? Again, we were kind of quite perplexed when we thought about this to start with. But I think in the end, we came up with a number of possible explanatory factors, which kind of might help explain why students in Poland just did not see themselves as very different from the wider population. I think the first and perhaps the most plausible explanation relates to the sharp increase in higher education participation that Poland has witnessed, particularly over the past 30 years. So in 1989, for example, only 10% of each age cohort progressed to university, whereas now the comparable figure is about 50%. And while this 50% isn't very different from some of the other European countries in the study, so in England, for example, it's a similar figure, the rate of increase in Poland has been notably higher. So the rate of expansion is much higher in Poland than in many other European countries. And I think this may lead to a perception among Poles that now everybody is going to higher education and it's no longer associated with any special social status. And there's been other research that has backed this up to some extent. So a recent survey conducted in Poland indicated that 78% of those interviewed believe that everyone can study, perhaps linked to this sharp increase in the percentage of each cohort progressing to university, but also the perceived ease of accessing most courses, even in prestigious universities. I think it's also possible that students' views may be informed by the legacy of Poland's communist past, in which no elite groups were recognised and individuals were seen only as peasants, workers, or intellectual workers. So it's possible there's that some kind of that cultural influence too. But I think also another possible hypothesis is the prevalence of paid work in Poland and how this might affect students' perspectives. And I think there's a kind of an interesting study here in Estonia, which I just briefly want to mention because I think there are parallels to the Polish case. So Deakin et al., in their analysis of Estonian students, they've argued that paid work is much more significant to students than their higher education studies, largely because Estonian students believe employers view it as a more important marker of their abilities than their degree result. Although the level of student employment in Poland is similar to that in some of our other countries, the documented belief among the population at large that a degree has low labour market value may encourage students to foreground their worker identity rather than that associated with their studies. And indeed, another project that asks students who have engaged in paid work alongside their studies, whether they identify primarily as a student or a worker, has indicated that the percentage choosing the worker identity is very high in Poland, almost 50%, compared to around 25% in Ireland and only 9% in Denmark. So we think that perhaps that is another reason why actually student identities aren't important to students, is because they're prioritising this worker identity, because they believe that it's that will help them help distinguish themselves from other graduates of the mass higher education system in Poland. And then finally, I think some of these ideas might be reinforced by institutional assumptions. It was really notable when we did the field work in Poland that there just weren't any social spaces for students. So this is a photo I took of the most kind of communal space that was available. So there was nowhere really for students to sit down. They had to perch on tables, and there was one small vending machine. And that really contrasted with the architectural spaces in the vast majority of universities in the other countries. But so this seemed to kind of reinforce this sense that, you know, university was kind of somewhere you went to study and then you left and had the rest of your life elsewhere. But I think obviously here cause and effect are hard to determine. So where does that leave us? So what now to kind of relate some of this kind of data back to the academic literature that I outlined at the start. And first of all, I suppose the debate about whether students are actually becoming increasingly similar. So I think this data does speak to debates about European homogenisation. And clearly there are some important commonalities in conceptualizations of what it means to be a higher education student amongst our focus group participants. So, for example, the examples I've given you about the centrality of learning and hard work was evident in most of our 54 focus groups. And I think this does suggest that the majority of those involved in our research had a rather less instrumental view of education than is sometimes suggested in the literature. And they were all committed to putting in a sufficient degree of effort to show they got the best out of their degree programmes. But I think these commonalities can be set against some of the differences that were also evident in our study. So, as I've just been saying, Spanish students differ from their counterparts in having a much less positive view of what it means to be a higher education student, and more likely than their peers in other countries to make references to ideas associated with consumerism and marketisation. And then, as I've just been saying on the previous slide, Poland also exhibited some national differences, with participants typically conceptualising students as little different from other members of society. In all other countries, students were much more likely to identify a range of characteristics that they thought were specific to higher education students. And so I think taken together, these differences do raise questions about the extent to which higher education systems are converging as a result of the Bologna process and the creation of the European higher education area, as scholars such as Moutsios and Slaughter and Cantwell have argued. And it seems, in relation to student understandings at least, that there do remain some significant differences which are informed by the particular histories of nation states and their specific social, political and economic contexts. As well as speaking to debates about the degree of coherence and convergence across Europe, I think our data also inform our views about the extent to which nations can be viewed as sharing common understandings. The disconnects that I've kind of alluded to, although I haven't gone into a huge amount of depth, between policy emphases and student understandings suggests, I think, that nations shouldn't be necessarily understood as coherent educational entities. And what it means to be a student in contemporary society can, in some countries, differ quite markedly between policy actors and students themselves. And I think, secondly, as well as speaking to debates about European homogenisation, the data also speak to debates about students as consumers. So, as I mentioned right at the start, various scholars have argued that as a result of market reforms across Europe, students have become increasingly consumerist in their outlook. But I think the Plasticine models produced by our participants were generally more ambivalent with respect to such discussions. Although, as I've suggested, their emphasis on the importance of hard work can be read as an internalisation of neoliberal imperatives, and in some cases a reflection of the language used by policymakers, I think this reading is to some extent in tension with the non-instrumental focus implicit in the emphasis of so many students on their love of learning and their sense that it was this that was central to their identity as higher education students. And I think in these cases, we can see the strength of more traditional understandings of the purpose of higher education being played out amongst students, which foreground ideas about knowledge acquisition and personal growth rather than labour market readiness. And I think here, our findings resonate with those of scholars such as Tomlinson, who've argued that even in countries such as England, where fees are very high and policy tends to focus on developing future workers rather than critical thinkers, students are often quite resistant to being positioned as consumers, believing that it underplays the efforts they have to put into their own learning and has an adverse effect on their relationships with their teachers. And I think it's intriguing that the understandings of students as consumers came not from the countries that are typically assumed to have the most firmly entrenched market-based systems, such as England, or those where higher education institutions tend to treat students as consumers, Denmark, England and Ireland in our analysis. But from Spain, where market reforms have been introduced relatively late, and policymakers remain themselves quite resistant to consumer discourse. And in explaining this variation, I've suggested that the broader economic context may be key, and that students may come to understand their position very differently if they're concerned about their labour market outcomes. But as I've also suggested, it might be the case that the specific stage of policy implementation is important, with students in Spain more concerned about the impact of marketisation because it has yet to be normalised nationally. In contrast, in England, market logic has informed the higher education sector for a long time and may either be not noticed or not deemed worthy of comment by students. So I think the data indicate that differences between students in different nation states cannot easily be read off policy pronouncements and formal policy positions. Moreover, I think it suggests that there's not always a straightforward relationship between policy and student subjectivities, and that to understand the experiences of being a student in contemporary Europe, we need to look beyond policy and political rhetoric to the lived experiences of individuals. So that's it. Thank you very much for listening. If you'd like to find out more, we have a project website, and what I've said today is based on this article here, but we've also written a book from the whole project, which is available open access through Policy Press. So thank you for listening, and happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I just found myself fascinated by the Play-Doh and really reflecting on, because we've just had this big jobs ready package that came through policy and government and really influenced funding, and it's all about jobs and university students getting jobs. And I wondered in my mind what Australian students what sculptures they would construct, and I might ask you that shortly. I've got some questions about methodology as well, but seeing as we're actually where you've landed, I will ask this question first. This is from David Bowd, who's online. Can you say more about the apparent disconnect between what you found and the political media academic discourse about students and their behaviour? Why has there been so much focus in the literature on neoliberalism, consumerism, etc., when this doesn't seem to reflect what is occurring on the ground?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. Yes, so I think in pretty much all of the countries we did find this disconnect between the foregrounding of, I suppose, in the policy text, across all countries, the most common construction of student was this future worker, and it was all about kind of employment readiness. And I suppose my argument would be that's kind of something that policymakers focus on, because often they're having to justify expenditure on higher education to taxpayers, and perhaps that's the easiest way to do that. And perhaps if you're talking about kind of public good, the importance of knowledge, that's or politicians think that's harder to communicate to taxpayers. But I also think that that probably does reflect the kind of cost benefit analysis that politicians, the logic that policymakers use, that if they're thinking about money going into higher education, they're thinking about kind of productivity, tax paid afterwards. So I think there are various reasons for that. What I think is kind of perhaps a bit more surprising is that in Europe there's very little kind of broader public debate within newspapers about the kind of the public value of higher education, knowledge acquisition. And I think that's one of the things that we've called for. Perhaps we need to listen to students more to widen that debate about what higher education is all about and what different people understand it to be. And in relation to higher education staff, and I think that's something that we found a little surprising, that staff seem to think that students were very transactional, very instrumental, and not recognising the kind of the narratives that students themselves had. And I think that's kind of a little bit depressing that that there is a disconnect between people who are in classrooms every day with students and students themselves. But I think sometimes that was used almost kind of as a way of standing up for students against policies that staff didn't like. So they were sort of saying that actually, you know, this policy was having a negative effect on these students because all they think about is work now. And it was a kind of almost a means of them kind of critiquing policy rather than necessarily kind of perhaps being very attuned to what students themselves think. But I think in terms of implications of our study, that is something that we have kind of written a bit about, the kind of importance of higher education staff, realising that, you know, not all students are motivated just by the employment rewards, and that actually, you know, the love of the knowledge, the love of the learning is there, and then they're not expecting to just sort of pay their fee and get their degree certificate. They realise that a lot of hard work is involved. So I think, you know, that is one of the implications for higher education staff, that perhaps they need to have a more rounded understanding of what it is motivating students.
Mm. And I guess, I mean, the staff are the ones who are reading the policies and kind of looking at the prevalence of the critique of neoliberalism in academic papers, or at least some of the staff. And so I can see why for them, they're more aware of it and more doing that kind of internal comparison with what they're saying on the ground, and perhaps advocating for students, like you mentioned, do that. While we're doing that, lots of questions coming through, and I might ask you at this point just to maybe elaborate a bit about the methodology, and in particular, you know, why you used Plato. I do have a question here about how were students selected in each country? Could some of the differences be explained in terms of selection, especially if it was self-selection? But broadly, I mean, I'm interested in the methodology, how you looked at discourses, if it was discourses, the analysis and the use of Plato to contrast, and then maybe something about specifically the sampling and the selection.
Yeah, sure. So the project as a whole was mixed methods. So we did have some quantitative elements. So there was a quantitative element to our website analysis and also our newspaper article analysis. But we also did a kind of discourse analysis of the newspaper articles. And I suppose in terms of our kind of interview data and focus group data, we adopted a kind of a thematic analysis approach to that. But it was a kind of a challenge, having a variety of different methods and, you know, quite a big team. And I suppose integrating those different methods was a challenge. And I suppose we did that by focusing initially on the strands, so the student strand, the institutional strand, the policy strand, and the media strand, and then sort of cross-cutting that by nation, and then looking at everything together. So there was a kind of a systematic process to it, but we were looking within each of those at different types of methods. We chose the plasticine model for a number of reasons, I think. First of all, the focus groups were very good at getting kinds of collective data or group data, but we didn't have, if we hadn't used the plasticine, it would have been quite difficult to get at the views of individuals. So it did allow us to have individual perspectives as well as group ones. It also, I think, another reason was kind of focusing students on what was the most important construction to them, because in the focus groups we discussed lots of different constructions, some of which, you know, they suggested, others that we asked them what they thought about X, Y, or Z. But I think the plasticine model forced them to make a decision about what was the most important to them, and so that was useful. And then thirdly, I think it was also a really good ice-breaking activity. So normally in the focus groups the students hadn't met each other before, and I think doing a kind of fun activity together and showing each other their models, I think it did help break the ice. It did establish some relationships between individuals in the group, which then I think when we went into the kind of, you know, the main part of the focus group, they felt quite comfortable talking with one another. So that those were some of the kind of reasons for it. I should say I had quite a lot of concerns about doing it, because I did wonder whether some people would just see this as kind of, you know, a very childish exercise and be very reluctant to do it, or whether there are quite different higher education cultures in Europe. So, for example, in the UK, you know, somebody might do plasticine modelling as part of an education exercise, whereas in Germany, where the culture is much more formal, I wondered whether they would just think this is a ridiculous thing for us to be doing as, you know, university research. and there'd be reticence. But actually, students responded really well in all those different national contexts, which I was relieved about. But I think it did then make the data much more comparable, because I was worried about that at the start. And then in terms of the student selection, that's a really good question. What we tried to do, we started off thinking that what we wanted to do in each university was to select students who were broadly representative of the overall student population. So, if they were mainly studying on vocational courses at this particular institution, we wanted mainly students on vocational courses. We wanted to have the gender split that represented the higher education institution as a whole, and also the ethnicity split, and in relation to the age of students as well, whether they're mature students or not. So that was kind of our ideal, but we often had to compromise quite a bit just because of the difficulty of recruiting students. And so we overrepresented students on arts and social science courses and underrepresented science students, and also we have more women than men. That doesn't reflect the composition of the higher education institutions in all cases. And in terms of how we actually recruited them, that differed quite a bit from institution to institution, because we asked the institution what they thought would be the most effective way of selecting students. So typically, we did ask for volunteers, and then amongst the volunteers, we then selected the students that we wanted for the focus group to try and get those demographic characteristics. In some institutions, we had a lot more volunteers to choose from than others. And I think that's why, in the end, we ended up with overrepresentation of women and social science students. But I think typically the students, we offered a kind of a voucher, which we felt offset to some extent the fact that, it mitigated just kind of very keen students who loved learning, putting themselves forward because there was some monetary reward. I think if we hadn't done that, I'd be much more concerned about perhaps the love of learning just coming through kind of very keen students. But I think we did, and it was our sense when we were doing the focus groups that there was quite a kind of diversity in terms of students' kind of academic backgrounds, etc. And in terms of social class, we actually had quite a diverse sample in all of the institutions. So I think that is a kind of limitation that to some extent we were relying on students putting themselves forward, but because we didn't choose everybody who volunteered, that did allow us to have, I think, a slightly more diverse sample in that respect.
Thank you. And actually, I've got a question here from Matt, who is in the room, who can ask the question. I think if you like, Matt, or I can, well, I've got the microphone up here, about whether you observed any differences by cohort. So you've just mentioned, the mature age, different class, gender, and I think you've seen a paper on international students as well. I wonder if you wanted to comment about any of those characteristics or other characteristics.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I should say that we excluded certain groups from our analysis, so we didn't actually have any international students, and we didn't have any postgraduate students, because we just felt that there were kind of a lot of other issues going on for those two groups. And because we used the focus group methodology, it was actually quite difficult for us to separate out other responses, so for example by social class or gender. And in terms of the plasticity models, which was the only way where we got individual data, there didn't seem to be any differences by those kinds of socioeconomic characteristics. However, and I didn't have time to talk about the institutional differences, but we were able to identify some institutional differences. I think some of those do map on to differences by social class, for example. So in England, actually, I'm not sure if I've got the, oh no, you're saying that. Yes, it was in England, we had 3 different universities of different kind of statuses, and the lowest status institution, there the students did talk about money much more than in the other 2 institutions. So in their models, there were quite a lot of like banknotes made and things like that, either to represent they felt really poor as students and that was their main identity as a poor person, or what they hoped the job would lead to, money. And I think when we've written about that, we've argued that in Britain there's a very strong correlation between the status of the university and its social class composition. And actually, there's quite a lot of literature that, you know, students from families without a history of higher education are much more worried or motivated by the economic rewards than perhaps more privileged students, but also much more likely to suffer financial difficulty during their studies. So there, I think, although that's like, you know, that shows up as an institutional difference, I think that is explained largely by the student's personal background, and that we did see differences there with more working class students at that particular institution. But because of our methodology, it's very difficult for us to untangle other social variables, I'm afraid.
I might take one more question, which is up here, and then I'll do a formal close. And if anyone else has any questions in the room, we can ask. Margaret, this is your question. Do you want to ask, and I will repeat it for the microphone?
There's, you know, ChatGPT upended my life a little bit. You know, that's the only reason it bothers me. Whatever. But you don't have to repeat this bit, Roland. The point is that there's a lot of conversation about cheating, and that students will cheat, and that, in my view, fits into this very instrumental view that you're talking about your data had pushback to. And I wondered if you had any comment about how you think against this data suggests we might want to think about trusting students and the relationship of trust we have between them, institutions and students.
Yeah, I suppose I don't think it's necessarily a problem of trust. It's more about understanding what motivates students. And I think, I mean, I think maybe then the cheating does kind of, you know, follow from that. But if you think students, if you understand students as being motivated by the knowledge and the learning, then I guess, you know, you're going to have a different view about kind of, you know, whether they're likely to cheat at all, and if they do cheat, what are the motivations for that, and a much more sympathetic understanding of students. And I think, you know, that isn't my area of research at all, that kind of plagiarism area, but I think, you know, that's my understanding is that's the argument there, that, you know, it is often through lack of trust, and actually the key thing is to explore the reasons why a student, you know, might choose to plagiarise or not. But I think, you know, broadly understanding students as, you know, many there for the learning, I mean, for the employment advantages as well. But I think if you're recognising that, then probably that kind of, you know, does lead to greater trust between staff and students. And then, you know, if they are using AI like that, kind of, you know, a dialogue about why that is, because I guess some people could see that as kind of enhancing their learning, not cheating at all. So I'm not sure if that answers your question at all.
No, thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I might conclude the official the official ceremony. I don't know. I can't think of the word. With it on that point, and just reflecting on, you know, if there was less dissonance between student and staff constructions of what the student role is, I wonder whether if we had a better shared understanding of that, we might be able to have more constructive dialogues around, you know, how we work with AI and how we you know, acknowledging the role of that in future assessment. I want to say a big thank you for sharing this research with us, and you know, we do a lot of higher ed research at Deakin, and the ability to do such a big project and across multiple countries, 6 countries with 300 students, and then not to mention staff and policy, is really impressive and something to aspire to. As I close, I want to please remind everyone that the recording and slides will be available. They'll be sent out to everyone who officially registered, but also just to plug our next seminars. I'll plug 2, if that's okay with everyone. March the 1st, which is Wednesday at 2 p.m, we have the second in our ChatGPT series. The first one was really around managers and leaders' perspectives on how to manage and work with AI or ChatGPT. The next one is really around the teaching and learning and educators' response to ChatGPT. We also have a second one in March, and that's on Wednesday, the 15th of March at 4 p.m. And that's our book launch for Assessment for Inclusion in Higher Education. We'll have Liz Johnson and Sally Kift presenting alongside the editors of the book. So with that, and a big thank you for Rachel for such an interesting presentation, and I'll see you all again in the future. Thank you.